Thanks for having us here, Alpha. Really appreciate the partnership on Second Front, most importantly, but also for letting us speak here. Excited to be co-invested with you in Second Front Systems. Folks have been hearing a lot about defense tech within the last year or so. More than $40 billion of private investment pouring into the space, and there's a lot of hype around it. But that's also because we're at a really exciting moment of transformation too for the government. Why is there all this hype around the market, and why is there this moment of transformation?
Yeah. First, echo the sentiment. Grateful for the opportunity to be here in the partnership. Alpha and teams, thank you. I think you've seen sort of a multi-generational trend in terms of sort of inadequate technology, a bunch of rapidly sort of shifting geopolitics. And as you've seen some of those earlier, maybe more digital native consumers grow into being agency and departmental and sort of congressional leaders, I think you're seeing a little bit more of an appetite, and then a bunch of, post 9/11 vets have sort of popped out into technology. So you're seeing a little bit more of like an appetite for the mission. And I think those sort of intersected at an opportune time in the market, and then add in some of the stuff happening in Europe and Asia, and I think it's just highlighted the velocity we need to move at. And then folks like you guys are helping to make that a reality.
Yeah, totally. So one of my favorite parts about being an investor in the sector is getting to work with founding teams that have experience firsthand in the military, in the intelligence community, in government, and are now coming out on the outside and fixing problems that they experienced on the inside firsthand. How has that experience from you and others on your team shaped how you guys have thought about Second Front and building Game Warden?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it would be very challenging to go cold into sort of like any regulated industry, presupposing that you've got a solution to some big sticky problem without having some deep experience or insight into how does that problem manifest, why does that problem manifest, like what has been tried before. So we've been fortunate. We've got folks who were chief data scientists at the CIA and the chief information security officer for the director of national intelligence, and like half the original software team out of Joint Special Operations Command. And that allows us to not only sort of have, domain expertise and sort of, good sort of customer intimacy, but to understand sort of the context around the friction. Because anybody who's worked with the government, right, there's a simple answer for pretty much every problem, and then there's like 500 pages of policy that complicates the simple answer. So sort of understanding that and being able to contextualize simplicity into sort of operational utility is where I think we benefit from sort of the team, and it allows us to maintain velocity there.
What are some of those hidden trap doors that folks are running into that you guys have solved and are giving you a moat that people might not recognize?
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard, right? Like you're effectively trying to bridge time. Or the earlier conversation, someone was talking about sort of like, second to third wave, industrial age to knowledge age. Like we're effectively trying to take an organization that still operates as if it's building sort of like linear production line, single sort of ship or airplane or thing like that, and introduce a concept where I can have tens of thousands of software updates a day that are getting approved, that are in, that just breaks a construct of the human in there, right? And if it breaks the construct of the human, that assume that most of those policies, most of those procedures, most of those, governance sort of boards they have are all designed for the former, right? That industrial age sort of top-down approach versus that knowledge age. So the magic is, everybody talks about the accreditation, like getting the stamp of approval as the magic. We think that's kind of just a feature, right? The magic is having stable runtime inside sort of these regulated networks and having the availability and the accessibility. So we started at runtime and worked backwards. Like our developer environment was the recent thing we released, where you had other folks starting there first, saying, hey, come build on us, and then we can bring you through. we started at like, what does success look like and what does stability and observability look like, and came back.
Yeah. And you need to earn the trust of those mission owners and those
100%.
network owners, right? I think one of the things that as an investor, you think you learn the business over a certain time, but I think one of the things that we've come to appreciate even more so is just the complexity of that network. I mean, I think in the Army, there's about 96 different networks that they're trying to consolidate, and each of those are their own different fiefdoms and stuff that you guys are
I
unique.
mean, anybody who's been like a CIO or a CTO and has dealt with like shadow IT, imagine that at like a quasi-global scale where anybody who's got a program with a special classification has effectively their own subnet and their own enclave. None of this is in like a master list anywhere. Like there is no, you can't call somebody and say like, hey, okay, I have a question about like network 5. Yeah. You have to go find like the guy who's in charge of network 5 and ask them the question. So to Drew's point, like, we spend a lot of time with those network owners, sort of like laying track, right? Get the runtime environment stood up, and then we walk that back and federate that into the pipelines so that when you come through, it's one push, many runtime. That is just like laborious and not exciting work.
Yeah. It also puts you at an interesting perspective, though, kind of as the interlocutor between the tech ecosystem and the government customer. Clearly, we're all obligated to ask a question about AI here. So I'll ask you one. What are you seeing in kind of the government customer's appetite for onboarding AI apps into their environment? And kind of how is Second Front positioned to capitalize from this AI wave as it starts to reach the government?
Yeah. So it depends, right? I think a lot of folks talk about the government as a single buyer. The government, you know, if you're like Lockheed Martin and you're selling airplanes, like, yeah, it's a monolith, it's a single buyer. If you are selling software or you are selling something like down into users, it's not an 800-pound gorilla, it's 800 one-pound gorillas who all think they're an 800-pound gorilla, right? So it depends. There are policies from the CIO of the DoD that says one thing that are contradicted down at like a departmental level. There is a concern around security. Most bureaucracies, when they're concerned about progress or velocity or security, they kill it in the bureaucratic way. They don't say yes, they don't say no. They just continue to assess and analyze. So you've got some of that going on right now. We're running a bunch of LLM capability like in classified and regulated environments, so it's happening. The government right now is missing technical leadership. You've oddly got like some good opinionation at Congress. You've got, I think, some good opinionation and technical gravitas in the intelligence community at a couple different places. And then you have it below the department, like in the services and some of the agencies. You don't have it at DoD proper right now, which is kind of gumming up the gears.
Totally makes sense, yeah. So government, obviously a large market and an exciting market with its complexities and challenges. A lot of investors in the room right now have portfolio companies that might have capabilities that they're like, hey, I could see the government wanting this. If I'm one of the folks in the audience kind of looking through my portfolio and identifying some of those companies that might have that opportunity, what's the right stage to introduce them to somebody like yourself? And what does right look like, and how do we go about that?
Stage is the only caveat will be, right, if they're pre-product, like our team is happy to just talk to them and just show them sort of what the other side of the wall looks like if you think about it in a walled garden, and just give some advice on dependencies to avoid. If they're post-product, yeah, hey, you're one of two things, right? You're starting to see demand or you've got conviction. From a technical standpoint, think about it like a walled garden, right? Like you want software to be able to run inside this walled garden. What that means is it can't have a ton of dependencies that need to exist outside of the walled garden, or it's not in a walled garden. That is a super simple thing to say. It is a shockingly difficult thing down at a software level where there's, either architectural debt or there's just some critical dependency. So think about it that way. It really is like, can it run on-prem? Can it run air gap? Is it designed to? Have they thought about that? That's sort of where I look at it there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And last question here. For those who aren't aware, Tyler also happens to be one of the hosts on the best podcast of the national security community called All Quiet on the Second Front. On each episode, he wraps it up by asking guests if they were king or queen for a day, respectively, and had a magic wand and could change one thing, what would they change and why? So I'll put that question back onto you here today. What would you change and why?
I would probably mandate that whoever the next Secretary of Defense is has to reduce the number of personnel and agencies by at least 10%. Just leave it there and just start there. I think we've grown to the point that there's 1,600 humans that are writing technical policy for the department, and I still cannot get a clear opinionation on like the relative security of a very simple containerized model. Like, it's just unacceptable. So, I don't know, I'd apply some pressure.
Totally makes sense. Yeah, well, we're appreciative that folks like you are doing the hard work of trying to simplify that so that our portfolio companies can sell into the government.
Wouldn't be able to do it without you guys, so thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Can I ask one lightning round question to both of you? We live in a decade of global competition. What you're doing is going to make a big difference, I think, Tyler. And Drew, you're investing in this category. Are there investment opportunities around strategic global competition in this decade that people should be thinking about? I don't know if you can answer that in a minute each, but I think it's really interesting. And then we'll go into the break.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to take the lead on that. I think there's kind of two areas that we think about it. Obviously, Moore is kind of well known as a global macro investor in public markets, and so there's tight connectivity between that and thinking about national security, thinking about defense investing. But I think there's two particular areas underneath it that really interest us. Number one is, to a lot of what Tyler's talking about, there's an inherent cost of doing business with the government, right? There's a lot of regulatory work and policy work and compliance that needs to go into being able to be equipped to sell into the government, right? And what you're seeing is there's some folks that are trying to drive standardization across those policies. Obviously, the ATO that Second Front helps equip companies with is one. There's an emerging process called CMMC, which is a baseline cybersecurity standard that every single government contractor, whether you're cutting the grass on an Air Force base or whether you're designing the next fighter jet, you're going to have to meet at least these minimum standards. So we love investing in businesses that help companies bridge that gap and go to market across those various compliance regimes. I think the other area that we're interested in investing in is you see this dynamic where the nature of conflict is changing, right? War is now drones and electronic warfare, right? A lot of the spectrum and kind of domains, we call them, in warfare, right, are now becoming contested that were previously not contested. And so you need this development of new capability that does not exist in the industrial base today, right? And so there's a lot of companies in there that are becoming these N of ones and developing really critical solutions for the government. A few other portfolio companies that we have that fit that mold are folks like Shift5, who is also a Second Front customer, which works on cybersecurity and predictive maintenance analytics for weapon systems. Forterra, which is an autonomous ground vehicle business, currently supporting one of the DoD's first autonomous ground vehicle programs for unmanned ship-killing missiles. So there's some important parts of the stack that still need to be solved.
Man, I hate following you because you're really smart. Look, I look at geopolitical trends and threats and what national identity, access to data, control relative to contested spectrum, relative to what I see as a degrading trust in sort of like public infra. Where I look at things and see interesting trends is sovereignty and provenance of data, of custom sort of private cloud. Maybe it's hybrid. There's probably a category term for it that I'm saying wrong, but there is increased opinionation and demand at national and subnational levels for data control and for data ownership. And if we think that's all going to sit in like an AWS public cloud, we are all wrong.
I think that's a really great point. And likewise, there's because of these unique controls and unique requirements of the government customer, the solutions that emerge and best in class in bridging those gaps for the government are going to look different than they do in the commercial space. Yeah. And I think kind of one of the dark underbellies of the defense investing landscape that folks don't talk about is like the exit pathways. And the reality is like Lockheed, Raytheon, et cetera, they all trade at like 2 times revenue. So they can't buy all these venture-backed companies at 20 times revenue and in a creative manner. But Microsoft, Google, right? All these large cloud companies, these commercial incumbents that don't have these specially developed solutions that meet those government requirements, they can buy companies at 10, 20 times.
It changes the notion of what a platform play is.
Exactly, yeah.
I think we're over time.
Great.
Sorry.
So I think Tyler and Drew are going to hang out for a bit during the break. We're going to start the break. We're going to be back here at 3 o'clock sharp. Right, Tyler?
Sir.
Takes an Army officer to build a company like this, like our other company, Shield AI. We're really proud to be an investor in Second Front. Please have a great break, talk to each other, and come back at 3 o'clock. Be ready to start. Thanks.